Welcome to the Wayne Public Library's virtual author chat. My guest today is Michelle Renee Lane. Michelle holds an MFA in writing popular fiction from Seton Hill University. She writes dark, speculative fiction about identity politics and women of color battling their inner demons while falling in love with monsters. Her work includes elements of fantasy, horror, romance, and erotica. Her short fiction appears in the anthologies Terror Politico, A Screaming World in Chaos, The Monstrous Feminine, Dark Tales of Dangerous Women, The Dystopian States of America, Graveyard Smash, Dead Awake, Midnight and Indigo, 22 speculative stories by Black women writers, The One That Got Away, and In Trouble, and has been featured on the Wicked Library podcast. Her debut novel, Invisible Chains, was nominated for a Bram Stoker Award. Book one of her erotic paranormal romance series, The Courtship of Nora Fagan, was published by Stardust Romance in 2022. Her nonfiction can be found in Medium, Speculative Chic, and in Writer's Workshop of Horror 2. Welcome, Michelle. Please tell us a little more about yourself and your new novel, The Courtship of Nora Fagan.
Hi. So a little bit about me. I live in Pittsburgh. I've lived here long enough to consider myself a native. And I'm excited to be back in the area. I moved back about a year ago. I lived here for 16 years. My son was born here. And we moved back about a year ago after living where I grew up for a while in the Carlisle area. And so I'm back in Pittsburgh. I'm writing more now than I was in the last several years. I've managed to do some publishing pretty consistently over the last few years, but I feel like I'm a little more dedicated to writing right now. And part of that is because I have this new book series, and Nora Fagan, The Courtship of Nora Fagan is the first book in that series. And it is it's going to be a 5-book series. So I have a lot of writing ahead of me. I'm currently working on the second book in the series. And I'm also working on the follow-up to my first novel, Invisible Chains.
Wow, that's wonderful. And congratulations on the Bram Stoker Award.
Thank you.
Pretty fantastic for especially a debut. That's excellent.
Yeah, thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Courtship of Nora Fagan, something that's not in the blurb?
Sure. So first of all, this book is the product of probably 16 years of starting and stopping. A lot of the series is written, but it's written in huge chunks that as I start focusing more on piecing the pieces together for each book, I'm starting to think that the story is evolving into something else that I didn't expect. And I feel like the thing that always kind of surprises me is that this story started as fan fiction. Several years ago, before I started writing on a more serious level, I was just sort of writing to entertain myself because that's what I did. I didn't really think about publishing my work. I daydreamed about it, but I didn't think that I would actually do it. And so a lot of what I was doing to pass the time was writing fan fiction. And this, weirdly enough, started as Buffy fan fiction. It's one of my favorite TV shows of all time. I love those characters. And I continue to write fan fiction. I don't write a lot of it right now, but if I get stuck on a project, I don't feel like I'm getting a lot of ideas, if I'm having trouble developing the characters, I will play around with characters that I know already, that I'm sort of at home with, because it's just kind of a comfortable way to get into a story. And so this particular story began as Buffy fan fiction, and it has evolved drastically over the course of 16 years. I would pick this project up and I would work on it, and it's just kind of like sprawling all over the place. But when the main characters really started taking shape, I began to have a better sense of what I think the story is about. And again, I think that's going to continue to evolve, because while I'm working on this second book, I'm realizing I don't know what this second book is about yet. Like the first book is written, and you would think, oh, you start working on a series, you just kind of write it along, and you know your characters really well. And I feel like I'm getting to know them better every time I sit down to write them. Each book will have new characters introduced. Sometimes, the thing that really kind of fascinates me is, this main character, Azazel, who is a fallen angel. I feel like I know him better than any of the other characters. And I'm not sure why that is. But maybe his voice seems to be the loudest in my head. And so he tells me kind of where the story's going more than the other characters do. Nora's featured in the title of the first book. And so, she's obviously a main character, but I'm beginning to think that this series is really about this fallen angel, Azazel. Because he's been around for a very long time. He was there when Lucifer fell from heaven, and they have sort of built this bond, this relationship. They continue to work together. He is Lucifer's primary soul collector. So he's kind of like a celestial James Bond. And is very well dressed, very handsome, and has a love of jazz. I'm trying to work some of the cultural history of jazz here in Pittsburgh into this second book, because I think it's really interesting history. And because of his interest in jazz music and the Harlem Renaissance, because the book is set right now, we're kind of like in the late 40s. It's going to progress through to modern times, because they have this very long courtship, mainly because this arranged marriage between them is in place to maintain the balance between good and evil in the world. And they are going to end up getting married, but that's probably not going to happen until the last book. And so these other books will be an opportunity for each of them to sort of grow in their own journeys and together. But that's complicated, because one of the things that I feel like is one of the main stumbling points for them is they're not allowed to have sex with each other until after they're married, which makes things difficult for a long courtship that's ranging over 80 plus years, especially when she's a succubus and has to have sex in order to live, which means that she's going to have a lot of partners that are not her intended. So there's like jealousy sometimes, and for both of them, because he isn't necessarily going to just sit around and wait for her. He also has relationships with other people. And so I guess it's kind of like a paranormal polyamorous love story, and they're going to have to face all these different challenges together over their relationship, the fate of the world, their own personal growth. And I'm excited to keep writing about them because they've become more and more interesting as I go along.
I guess my one question out of everything you just said is, um, how do you plot your books? Because if um you're not sure, like like they're telling you, do do you have like an idea? You said you've been working on it for like 16 years. Um, do you know exactly it's definitely going to be 5 books, or could it turn into more?
That's debatable. I have agreed to 5 books, and so I'm contractually obligated to write 5 books. I don't know what's going to happen after that. When I started writing the second book, I thought I was like sick of it and never wanted to write another book in the series, but that's not an option. And fortunately, I'm interested in the characters again. I'm fine now. I think that's probably going to keep happening though, or I'm going to get bored with it and have to work on something else just to keep the interest level up. In terms of plotting, I really don't do a lot of that. I don't tend to outline things, but I'm beginning to think that I need to start thinking about doing that because otherwise I'm going to get very confused. I do some plotting when I'm working on a larger project like this. I did that a lot with my first book, where I would sort of just let the story go where it was going to go, but then I would hit a wall and be like, okay, I have no idea what's going to happen next. Like, I know how it begins, I know where I think it's going to end, and then there's this pesky middle part where I have to figure out, okay, my character's here and stuck in this situation. Well, what happens next? How do I get them to this next part? And what is that next part? What's that going to look like? But as I'm writing things, I all around me is inspiration. So, I'll be just out somewhere, overhear a conversation and think, oh my God, that's a really great line of dialogue. And I will write that down. And then I'll think to myself, okay, well, I already know who says this, but in what context and in what part of the book are they going to say this? And then it kind of just grows that way. So I tend to map things out when I get stuck, or if I'm in a situation where I literally have no idea where the story is going next. And I feel like I don't know, I don't really fully understand how writers who do plot, I don't understand how that works, because that's not how my brain functions. So sometimes I like to be surprised about where the story is going. Like for my first novel, I thought I knew exactly how it was going to end, and I ended up with 3 different endings because the characters needed a different ending by the time I was done writing. Yeah, it has a way of working itself out. It's not magic. It takes a lot of work and thought, but sometimes I just like to see where the story goes, and I like to be surprised sometimes.
Um, did we have a couple of questions? So, read that. Did Have you watched the Netflix show, the Lucifer? And
Oh, yes, absolutely.
did you draw any inspiration from that show if you watched it?
Um, in terms of my character, Lucifer, maybe a little bit, because he's kind of playful. He has a very good sense of humor. Yeah, I like the idea. I guess, I don't know. I've never really liked the way that the devil is treated in fiction. I guess he's one of my favorite characters in a lot of things. And I feel like sometimes he needs to be playful. because his job is terrible. Like I would not want that job. And so I tend to prefer to portray him in more of a humorous sort of way. He can be serious and helpful. And he's there to sort of make people think a little bit more deeply about what they're doing, how they view themselves, what they're capable of. So he's, he's an advocate for change, I guess. And he believes in self-determination. So, he's kind of like he almost acts like an advisor sometimes for Nora, because he's an adult in her life. Yeah, I don't know. I think the devil has gotten a bad rap. That's what I think.
Okay. And the other question is, do you listen to music when you write? And if you do, what do you listen to?
I do sometimes. Yeah, weirdly enough, again, like I feel like Azazel is driving this a lot of the time. And so I've been listening to a lot more jazz, a lot more music by Black artists, which is not something that was like completely new to me, but I feel like I'm being more intentional about listening to more music from different time periods, especially by Black creatives. There's a lot of new music that is mimicking a lot of the older sounds. I go out and see a lot of live music. I have access to a great vinyl collection right now. And so, yeah, music is important to me. And I feel like sometimes it does shape the stories that I'm writing, but more so it is about shaping the personalities of my characters. And so different characters are into different sounds. I wrote a short story a few years ago that ended up on the Wicked Library podcast, called An Acid Trip Through Time. And it was basically focusing on the hardcore scene of the mid 80s to early 90s. And so that definitely has a very hardcore punk soundtrack to it. But, because Azazel is really into jazz, that's a lot of what I'm listening to right now when I'm writing this particular book. Sometimes I'll be driving and listening to something and I will imagine him dancing to it. So I don't know what that's about, but I feel like he is definitely influenced by music. He really loves it. And so, yeah, when I'm working on this, I am listening to a lot of music, which, is interesting. Sometimes it's really distracting, because, especially if I know the lyrics really well. But if it's something I haven't heard for a while, I feel like music has a lot of power and it really does influence me creatively. Yeah.
Do you ever hear from your readers? And like, what kind of things do they say?
Yeah, I do hear from my readers. So what's kind of interesting about that is I feel like I have different categories of readers. And so I've been very fortunate to have a lot of amazing people in my life. And for some reason, I'm able to maintain relationships with people for long periods of time. So I have a lot of different friends from different phases and stages of my life. And recently, a friend of mine from childhood reached out to me and to let me know that she had read and finished the Nora Fagan book. And she had read my first novel too, which is a lot different than this book. And she told me that she really liked that one, but this book, it spoke to her more, and she felt more at home reading this particular type of story. And she hoped that I was not going to make her wait too long to read the next book. So that's that's fantastic. I love that people from my past are supporting me in this way. So I have a lot of friends and family who are reading my work and very, very supportive, and they have wonderful things to say. Another category of reader for me are other writers, which is really exciting for me because I'm trying to read their work and they're reading my work. And so having conversations around that, it's kind of, I don't know, it's unlike anything else I've experienced, because you get to have conversations about your work with people who are doing similar things, some people who I admire very much. And it's just, I don't even know how to describe that sometimes, because it's so exciting, and it inspires me to keep working, because when you are talking to someone you really admire and they say, oh, hey, I read your book, it's like, oh my God, that's great. And they're like, and I loved it. It was great. I hope you keep writing. That's good stuff. I love that kind of feedback. But it's still kind of strange, because you're like, oh my God, that person read my book. Now they know all my secrets, or at least all the secrets of my characters. And that's a really weird place to be in sometimes, especially with some of the stuff I write. Some of the stuff I write is very personal, and you can see me in the pages of the things that I write. So there's a lot of vulnerability attached to that, which is exciting, because I'm growing through this process. But sometimes it's really kind of scary, because I put myself out there and I'm not really sure what's going to happen sometimes.
That is true. That is true. All righty. So I was going to ask about a memorable reader encounter, but I think you just kind of shared one of those. And you're currently working, you said, on the two projects, the second of the series, the Courses of Nora Fagan, and also the second of the Invisible Chains. Is it hard to like change between the two, or you prefer that because it gives you like a break from the one? Is there similarities between the two?
They're very different. I feel like, well, I won't say, okay, what I will say is this. They both are, most of the things I write about feature female characters who have to go through some hard things to get to the other side, to get to the next phase of development, to get to know themselves better. So that's kind of across the board in everything I write. But Invisible Chains is more under the horror umbrella, and it's historical horror. It's a supernatural slave narrative, and really dark things happen in that book. And I'm working on the follow-up to that, and it's going to be darker than the first. I'm dealing with some really heavy subject matter. So writing this paranormal romance series at the same time, it does give me a break, because not only is it difficult sometimes to write about these darker subjects, but because it's historical fiction, even though it's an alternate reality in some ways, I do a lot of research to make sure that I'm getting things right. And right now, I'm reading a lot of nonfiction about the history of medicine and how slaves were used to develop certain procedures, specifically within the realm of gynecology. And that is some dark stuff. And so writing this series, this paranormal romance series, even though I'm writing about monsters and I'm writing about complicated relationships, it's still way lighter than what I'm trying to accomplish with these other books. Yeah, some dark things happen in this series, or will happen in this series, but it's still a bit more lighthearted than some of the other things I write about. And so I'm having fun working on this. So yeah, writing multiple things kind of helps me to balance that out, and I don't get down in a very dark hole like I did when I was writing my first novel. There were some very dark times when I was writing that book. And yeah, so working on multiple projects keeps it fun, keeps it interesting, but it is challenging sometimes to shift gears. But I'm also, working on short fiction also. I'm working on a piece right now. Again, that's more in the realm of horror. I'm writing a story about a plus size Black woman who has struggled with her weight her entire life. And people, she keeps hearing, you are what you eat, you are what you eat. And so things get pretty dark when she decides to eat the thing that she wishes to become. Let's just say that. So, I write a lot of different things simultaneously, because sometimes out of necessity, because I have deadlines, and sometimes because I just need a break from the darker stuff that I write. Yeah.
Okay. We have another question. Do you feel like erotica is a natural expansion fit for horror?
I do. I do. So I feel like I've always kind of understood that about myself. I didn't always understand it, but I knew that there was something going on in my brain about that. And recently, I watched the movie Bones and All, which I don't know if you are aware of this movie, or if you know about this movie. If you haven't seen it and you enjoy horror-based love stories, which I do, it's the sweet spot. And I didn't realize that was the sweet spot for me until I really started thinking about it while watching that movie. It's a love story. It's basically two young people who find each other. They're outsiders and they come together and they fall in love, and they have this really kind of weird, complicated, romantic adventure. But at the heart of it, they're monsters, and there are other monsters like them in the world that they keep running into, who make it difficult for them to be normal and just try to have a normal romantic life together. So horror and romance, horror and erotica in my brain fit together well. And I'm not sure what that's about. I'm not sure what that says about me as a person. It might just be that I'm trying to work through all of the terrible relationships that I was in as a teenager and in my 20s. Monsters have always been attractive to me in some way or another, because I can relate to them, because I see the beauty in the weird. And so, I've been obsessed with vampires since I was probably 11 or younger. And what's sexier than a vampire? I mean, I do unpack a lot of that fiction in my nonfiction and talk about the dangers of those toxic relationships. But I feel like you'd be hard pressed to not talk to someone about vampires and have the subject of sex not come up. I mean, they are the sexy leading men of so much fiction. Whether that's appropriate or not, it's a fact. Werewolves are super sexy. I challenge you to watch an episode of True Blood and not find one monster desirable. Good luck with that, but the horror and eroticism connect in our brains some way. It's the the don't touch, the danger. Danger is exciting. And I feel like it ramps up the sexuality in some cases. So, my bookshelves are filled with vampire romances. I'm never going to stop reading about vampires, regardless of how dangerous they would be in real life. So yeah, I feel like there's a natural connection between those two things. And I'm sure that Dr. Freud and Jung would have something to say about that too, because we all need to, face our shadows sometimes. But yeah, I think they're a good fit for each other.
Okay. A note, Atticus Ross and Trent Reznor did the awesome score for Bones and all.
Oh, yes, they did. Yeah, it was a great soundtrack. Yeah.
I was going to ask, how would you describe your author voice or your writing style?
Wow. That's a good question. My author voice. I'm not sure what to say about that. I feel like sometimes I am shocked by how much of me comes through on the page. So if I write something and put it aside and come back to it and read it, I'm like, oh my God, that's me. Oh my God. So I feel like my author voice is my subconscious in a lot of ways, or the parts of me I might be afraid to talk about face to face with people. It's my shadow self in a lot of ways, because I'm able to write about the darker things that I think about or feel without as much embarrassment as, sitting down across the table from someone and trying to communicate these things to them. So I feel like my author voice is this voice that has been inside me my entire life, since I was a kid. And it allows me to say the things that need to be said. And I feel like each time I sit down to write, that voice gets a little bit louder. I'm getting less afraid of what others might think in terms of what I'm writing about, the kinds of stories that I'm telling. In a lot of cases, I'm giving voice to the voiceless. I try to communicate what it's like to be in very difficult situations based on your ethnicity or your gender, or something that's beyond your control as a person, that sort of sets you aside in society in a way that puts you in the margins, which is why I think it's easy for me and comfortable for me to write about monsters in connection to characters who are going through, a personal journey to figure out what their identity is. Monsters are often safer company than other people for me in my stories. And so yeah, I guess this voice is probably, in some ways, is my inner child who has always been 40 plus years old, trapped in this child's body, trying to communicate all of these big thoughts and feelings. And now she finally has an outlet. Yeah.
And what would be like the most difficult part of writing for you, if there is any?
Sometimes it's just time. I work a full-time job. I'm a mom. I'm raising a teenage son who is high functioning autistic. So there are a lot of challenges there. I'm a sandwich generation, so I also have an aging parent, and there are a lot of responsibilities attached to that, even though she doesn't live with me. And maybe, the fact that because there's so much distance between us, it makes it even more difficult. So sometimes it's really just time. And along with time, it's energy, because the things that I want to write about take a certain amount of energy, either emotional energy, or just the physical energy to be able to stay awake and keep writing. And so the challenge for me is making the time to do it, because it's something that I really enjoy. It's one of the most important things to me in my life. But because of my other roles and duties, I almost always put myself last. And because of that, I don't write as often as I want to. So the challenge is often just sitting down and writing.
Fortunately, very common, very common.
Yeah.
Women. Another question is, would you ever collaborate on a writing project, and with whom would you want to collaborate?
Oh my goodness. So I had the opportunity to do that last year or the year before. I don't know. It's all running together. I feel like post-pandemic, it's all just a big blur. I had the opportunity to collaborate on 2 short stories with folks who were in my writing group at that time. And actually, I wrote a short story within this world of Nora Fagan, featuring Nora Fagan, with my friend Michael Burke, who is also an excellent. He's an excellent writer, and he's getting a lot more things published right now, and I'm super excited for him. So I have had the opportunity to do that. And I enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. I wasn't sure how that was going to work out, because sometimes I feel like the types of things I write might not always mesh with what other people are doing, but it worked out great. So I think I might want to do that again. Who I would want to collaborate with? My goodness. There are lots of people I'd love to collaborate with. But I'm not really sure what to say about that, because I'd love to write a story with Joe Lansdale. That would be really cool. I don't think that's ever going to happen. I'd love to write a story with Stephen Van Patten, because he also writes about vampires, and it would be kind of cool to collaborate on a vampire project, writing as people of color writing about vampires. I think that would be a cool collaboration. Who else would I want to write with? I don't know. I feel like sometimes, like in terms of fiction, I'm not always sure about that. I feel like I'm interested in collaborating on more like nonfiction projects with other people. Like right now, I'm going through this period of reading a lot of books that are either directly memoirs or have a memoirish feel to them. Particularly about the punk and hardcore movements in like Canada and here in the US in like the 80s and 90s. I'm about to read another memoir in that sort of same vein by someone I grew up with. I'm very curious to see what he has to say about the scene that we grew up in. But this is kind of like leading to more of like nonfiction discussions about that period and how to incorporate the like punk culture or the concept of punk into fiction. And so that's something I've been kind of talking about with a friend of mine, David Bailey, whose book I just finished like maybe about a month or so ago. So collaboration takes on different meanings for me sometimes. And so I'm not sure about fiction, but I definitely have some ideas about who I'd like to work on with some nonfiction.
Okay. I want to know that you've written short fiction and you've written novels. How do you determine the length of your writing projects? Have you covered, do you plot? Or,
That is a good question.
and seem to allow the characters to guide the narrative a bit. So, how do you know this is definitely going to be a short story, whereas this is going to be novel length or a series?
Right. Well, in this particular case with the Nora Fagan, A Marriage Made in Hell series, I had so much written that it couldn't just be one book. So again, in that case, it just kept going. I just kept writing it and kept writing it and kept writing it. And I didn't know if there was going to be an end in sight. I just knew that I needed to keep writing these characters. But now I have to give it shape. And so I have to take more control over that process and kind of rein them in. Normally, if I'm writing short fiction, it's either because I've been asked to contribute something to an anthology or I'm submitting something specific. I used to write a lot of short stories because I couldn't imagine writing a novel. Like when I finally wrote a novel, the whole process of it kind of surprised me. I'm still surprised by it sometimes because it doesn't always make sense. Like, how are you going to put all of these ideas together and end up with like this one thing? Like, how does that really happen? But if I'm writing short fiction, it's usually one idea or a theme or just a brief character arc, a moment in time. And so I feel like sometimes I just know, okay, I have this idea for this thing, like the short story that I mentioned just a little bit ago. Like I had this idea, it just came to me, this idea of you are what you eat. Well, if you're in this situation where you keep being told that, and if you take it literally, that's a short story. Could that potentially be a novel? Maybe. I don't know that I don't know that I'd be able to sustain that for a full novel. Sometimes it really is just the characters. Sometimes it really is them saying, look, I have this thing to tell you, but it's going to take a while. And while I'm telling you the story and you're writing it, you're going to hit this point where you realize, oh, no, it's not really about that. It's about this other thing. And then you're going to have to write about that a little bit more and wrap it all up. And so maybe it's novella length. Maybe it's a full novel length. Maybe it grows into more than one book. But it's just sort of the natural progression of a story and how a character develops over time. I'm not sure that I could put that in words that are better than that because I don't always fully understand that myself. But I feel like sometimes stories present themselves to me in a particular way, and sometimes they just take longer to tell.
And when you do sit down to write, um, do you have a writing routine? Do you, and how long on average? Like, how long did it take you to write the longest book? Like, took you the longest time to write, or how quickly did you write something else?
Okay. So my first novel, which is, it's a ballpark 90,000 words. Okay. That took me 3 years to write. And the reason it took 3 years was because it was a thesis novel. So it was part of the process of the MFA program. Could I have finished it sooner? Possibly. But I feel like I finished writing it when I was done writing it. And just because I finished writing it for to earn my MFA, that doesn't necessarily mean that the book was done. It was mostly done at that point. And then over the course of subbing it, pitching it, changes occurred over time. Once it got picked up for publication, I worked very closely with an excellent editor, and it changed even more, and it deepened some of the meaning. I rethought the ending. I rethought how some of the characters were behaving with each other. So that process technically took 3 years, but it took longer than that. For this first book in the Nora Fagan series, like I said, I started writing that like 16 years ago. So once I signed the contract for the series, while the first book was pretty close to being done, I had a lot less time to wrap it up. So that I only had a few months to do. Right now, it's May? It's 1st of May. The first draft of the second book is due in August. And I will meet that deadline. But I feel like it's going to need to be edited a little bit more closely. And hopefully I'll have time to figure out some things that I might not figure out right away. Ideally, that's what works best for me as a writer. First draft's fine, that's great. Obviously, that's not going to be your final draft. And as you go back and you do your edits and you do your rewrites, you sort of discover new things about the story. I tend to do a lot of that in my first draft, which may be why it takes me a little bit longer to come up with that first draft, because I don't feel like I'm ever just handing in a first draft. It feels more like a close to final draft in its first version, I guess, if that makes any sense. Because I'm doing a lot of editing as I go along. Yeah, I don't know. Does that help answer the question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And what piece of your work are you most proud of?
That's a tricky question. I feel like I'm most proud of Invisible Chains because it's the first full novel I wrote. It was published, and I developed a great working relationship with that publishing house. It got nominated for a Bram Stoker Award. And it was translated into Spanish, and there are people in Spain reading it and reviewing it and saying all kinds of great stuff. So I think that's probably what I'm most proud of, because it's had the most impact, I guess. And it's opened a lot of doors and made it possible for me to keep doing what I love.
Another question is, if you could picture the perfect cast for a film based on Invisible Chains, who would you pick for the cast, especially Jacqueline?
Wow. There are several young actresses that I've been following. And of course, what that means is right now, none of their names are going to come to mind because I'm drawing a complete blank. I guess what I want to say about that is there are more young actresses who are Black or ethnically mixed, who there are more to choose from now than there ever were even 16 years ago when I first started working on these different projects. So it's like there's a wealth of choices when I was compared to when I was first thinking about what these characters might look like. I will say that my vampire is based partially on a real person who I knew as a teenager. But physically, he's sort of modeled after Aidan Turner. I'd like to think that he would make an excellent, well, we already know that he makes an excellent vampire because he's excellent in being human. I don't know. I never know how to answer these questions, because it's like, you have to think about timing too. Like, I understand that it's like, a dream cast, but like, you have to think about like who's age appropriate for these characters, because, Jacqueline she's 15, 16 years old when the story begins. And yeah, I don't know. I would love for people to tell me who they think would make, who these characters should be in an actual cast for a movie. That would be great. But I really never know what to say, because I feel like as time goes by, my idea of that changes.
Okay. Hope that answers. If you have any suggestions, you can put it in the chat. Um, has there been anything that has influenced your writing in a significant way, such as an author, a book, a genre?
Yeah. So when I was first reading, there were always horror novels available to me as a kid. They were always around. That's like a favorite genre of my family. And so I read a lot of horror novels. But when I started choosing books for myself, I was particularly interested in Anne Rice's novels. So, I read a lot of her fiction, and I feel like she influenced me in terms of how vampire culture can work. And it can be very complicated and intriguing and fascinating. But as I started getting a little bit older and noticing that there weren't a lot of people in her books that look like me, especially not among the vampires, maybe a few here and there, I started feeling like I needed stories that featured more people that look like me. And so I started reading, I picked up Jewel Gomez's The Gilda Stories, and it blew me away because, not only was this other woman of color writing about vampires, but she had a very political tone to her work. She's an activist, and so that came through in her work. And she was not just writing about vampires who were female and Black and brown, but queer, and they were independent, and they were going on their own adventures and figuring themselves out. And it was really powerful. That book, I feel like that book changed my view of my own writing and what I was allowed to write about. And so, her voice gave my voice power. Toni Morrison's work, whether we're talking about Beloved or any of her other work, it's all pretty dark in some way or another, because she's writing about real things that happen to real people. Even when you have the supernatural elements in Beloved, she's still writing about post-traumatic stress in enslaved people. Like, that's what that book is really about. And so, I grew up watching all these Hammer horror movies and the Universal monsters and all that stuff, all the great stuff that really shaped the genre at that time. But the older I get, the more I realize that not everyone is afraid of the same things. And maybe I should be afraid of vampires, but I'm not as afraid of a vampire as I am of, say, the systems that oppress women and Black and brown people. Like, I'm more afraid of systemic racism than I am of a vampire. So, monsters can still be scary, but it's usually people or systems that are the focus of the horror in what I write. And so, I don't know. So I feel like the thing that influences me now, is just the horror that exists in the world, and the fact that I'm trying to understand the relationships between people and how they communicate with each other and what prevents them from getting closer together.
Okay, there's a comment. I'll read. So it was about Anne Rice. And even in the Feast of All Saints and with Merrick Mayfair, uh, Rice presents some serious issues of colorization. As much as I also love Rice and am hugely influenced by her.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Over the years, how has your writing changed, would you say?
I think I'm getting braver about what I write about. I feel like I'm getting to know myself better, and I feel like it's okay. It's safer, maybe, for me to tell certain stories. Maybe it's not, but I'm going to anyway, because it's time to tell them. And so maybe it's just that I feel safer in myself. I feel more confident in my voice. And I feel like it's just time to tell certain stories. So I would say, my female characters are stronger. Feel like they question more. They demand more of their male counterparts. they want a happy ending. They don't always get happy endings, but they want a happy ending. And my characters are willing to fight for those endings. I'm not always kind to them, so they don't always get what they're asking for, but they usually get what they need.
Okay. I'm going to turn to publishing now. Can you tell us a little bit about what your publishing journey was like?
So yeah. So I feel like I've been kind of fortunate in terms of working with really good people so far. My experience publishing my first novel it's probably spoiled me for all other experiences. I had a really great time working with the folks at Haverhill, and now I feel like I'm part of I know it sounds so cliche, but I feel like I'm part of a family with that publisher. So it's been really good so far. And I guess, I also want to say, before I go too far with that, I want to say that my experience with Stardust Romance has been really good too. I've had a really good working relationship with the folks who are publishing my current series. I think that it's gonna get better as it goes. But a lot of the stuff that I publish is short fiction and anthologies. And so I've had the experience of working with a couple of, like, Candisha Press. I've worked with them a couple of times. It's a woman-owned, woman-centered publishing house. They give voice to women in horror, and they're excellent to work with. I haven't had a lot of negative experiences, which is great. I know that is not always everyone's journey. That doesn't mean that every experience I have is going to be great. Who knows? But so far, I've had some really good experiences with publishing, and I can't recommend these folks enough. They're just really great to work with.
Okay. And what was the best piece of advice you've ever received with regards to your writing?
That's a great question. I've gotten some really good advice from a lot of different people over time. But I feel like the best advice that I ever got was from my mentor, Lucy Snyder, who told me that I had to kill my vampire. Had to kill him. And it took me 3 months to make that happen, because I had a hard time doing it. But she kept pushing me to do it. And it's a better book because of that. So yeah, I feel like that's some of the best advice I ever got. I will also say another piece of advice that I got recently was to just keep writing. It's simple. It's to the point. Just keep writing.
Do you have critique partners? Do you work with critique partners? And how important have they been for you for your writing career?
Yeah, actually, I do that. I don't do that as often as I did when I was in the writing program, because you have a couple, you come in with your cohort of other folks who are in the program with you. But the way that works is you end up workshopping different pieces, whether it's the novel you're working on or whether it's a short story you're trying to get published. So, each term I would have different critique partners assigned to me. So a lot of different people saw different pieces of what I was working on. But because of being part of that community, I have access to other writers who are willing to take a look at what I'm working on. There are certain people like my good friend Patricia Lilly, who is an excellent writer. She's an excellent editor. She's a great teacher of writing. She is like my go-to if I need to ask, does this sound like me? Does it sound like I wrote this? Or is this like completely like out in left field? How can I make this sound more like my writing? What's missing? What did I not do? And she's always there to make that happen because she's so familiar with my writing. I have other people that I rely on too, like Tim and Zazayas, who was kind of like my unofficial mentor in my MFA program, who fortunately he lives here in Pittsburgh. So if I have a writing question, I can, meet him for coffee or drop into, a write-in and be like, hey, I'm working on this thing. Would you mind looking at it? It's important to have folks like that in your life as a writer because contrary to popular belief, I don't have all the answers. I don't always know. And, I don't think it matters if I write 2 books, 10 books, 100 books. I feel like I'm always going to need that kind of feedback to make sure that what I'm doing is my best quality work. You need that feedback. And sometimes it's just, I have no idea what I'm doing. Could you take a look at this? And maybe we could brainstorm what happens next. Brainstorming is really important. And so if you have people who are willing to do that with you, that's excellent, because that is an invaluable situation where you can go to someone and be like, hey, I need this next thing to happen and I'm out of ideas. And you can just, sit there and talk through it. So yeah, critique partners are really important. And it doesn't matter what phase you're at as a writer. I feel like it's always valuable to have that.
And what piece of advice would you offer a new writer that's just starting out?
A new writer. I would say find your people. Find people who are writing similar things, or at the very least are interested in reading the kinds of things that you're writing. Whether those are people in a writing group, or whether those are, a couple of folks who you trust to be honest with you about your writing. But then also make time for yourself. I'm telling this to myself too. I'm trying to give myself some advice here, because if you're not making time to write, you're not creating the things that you need to create. It's not just about writing to get published. It's not just about writing to get paid. It's about the process and going through the action of writing to figure things out, to learn what you don't know, to get a better sense of what you can create, what you're capable of, what your limitations are, what you need to work on to improve, what you need to do to strengthen your voice. And I would also say, read as much as possible. Reading, you don't have to have an MFA to be a writer. You don't. But you absolutely need to read and write. Those are the 2 things you need to do, absolutely.
And it's usually what I hear from all the authors is writing, getting in your seat and getting to writing, and reading does help. see what's out there. Um, this is where I turn the chat feature over to anybody who wants to write a question for Michelle. Um, while you do that, I always save like the last question is my fun question. Um, so I'm going to ask it now. And as I mentioned earlier, I did listen to a lot of like podcasts and other interviews with you and read stuff. You, in a previous interview, you called yourself a narrative junkie and mentioned escapism as your drug of choice. What are some of the most recent books you've read, or TV series or movies that you've watched? You want to share some of those with us?
Okay. Most recently, I just finished reading The Spite House by Johnny Compton, and it was fantastic. It's an excellent piece of Southern Gothic horror. I'm expecting great things from this writer moving forward because that book was fantastic. Things that have been watching. I recently watched the series Swarm, which was really interesting. I wasn't really sure what to expect, but it was very dark and funny and weird, and disorienting sometimes. But I loved it. It was fantastic. And I highly recommend watching it because, again, there is a wealth of horror fiction, TV, movies right now that are featuring Black creatives, Black characters, that are just surprising sometimes. Not to say that I don't expect them to be good. I'm just blown away by where the stories go and the creative edge that, like, it's so unexpected sometimes that I get so excited for more because I'm thrilled that these stories exist and they're available to a wider audience. It's fantastic. I just recently watched Bones and All, and that just kind of blew me away. That was a fantastic movie. What else have I watched recently? Oh, well, so, Mark Rylance is one of my favorite actors, and he's in Bones and All. But I just watched him in The Outfit, and that was like a completely different type of story, but he was still spooky in that too. I watched a few months ago, I binge watched all of what's available of Pennyworth because I love that whole like 60s spy era British thing that's happening there. And because I grew up watching like The Prisoner, and I watched all the James Bond movies when I was growing up, and I even watched The Saint. I watched a lot of public television, and I watched a lot of British drama and spy stuff. I thought it was really cool stuff. And so I thought that like, it was definitely pastiche, because even though they were pulling on a lot of the tropes and a lot of the familiar sights and sounds, it was still very different. It had a really cool anachronistic feel to it because sometimes the music didn't necessarily sync up with the time period. I mean, it was always pretty close and related to theme, but it wasn't always matching up with what I thought the time period was. And so, my assumption was like, late 60s London. But again, it's a little anachronistic because it's also a little bit more 50s, and there's some like 70s creeping in there. But the costumes are amazing. The acting is fantastic. And, who doesn't want to watch, spies with British accents? I mean, that's great. And of course, because it's Pennyworth, it's the whole like Batman universe minus Batman, which I think in some ways is way cooler. yeah, those are the things that I've been escaping into. Yeah.
Sound like fun.
Yeah.
You got a yes, the Spike House is amazing.
Yeah.
Um, I have to make sure we have it here at the library. Take a look for it. Look for it.
It's very good.
Well, Michelle, thank you so much for joining us this evening. This was wonderful. I've learned so much. Um, I wish you all the best of luck with the next books in both or the second to this the series that you're writing. Um, Again, best of luck and thank you so much for joining us this evening and for everybody else who's joined.
Thank you so much. I had a wonderful time.